You're listening to a Hebrew in Israel podcast with Yoel Halevi, exploring the language, culture, and history of the Bible. For more information, visit us at HebrewInIsrael.net.
Shalom everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Hebrew in Israel Haftarah series. I'm your host, Yoel Halevi of HebrewInIsrael.net, and I want to thank you for joining me again. We are in the Haftarah of Haftarah Miqetz, and for just a recap of the story of Miqetz, because it's strongly connected to our Haftarah, we are actually in a episode in the cycle stories of Yosef, where Yosef demonstrates what we can define as divine knowledge. And there are several things which are defined as divine powers or godly powers. And one of them is telling the future, being able to discern the future from omens and partial knowledge and so on. And then in Israel, it's actually prophecy. Even though prophecy and dreams sometimes have a lot linked to one another, we still have this idea that in Israel, prophecy was a lot more powerful than, say, the king's dreams, Pharaoh's dreams, or anything like that. There's a certain sense of irony, by the way, that I think a lot of people, because I've never really seen anyone speak about this quite openly, but there's a certain sense of irony that Pharaoh is supposed to be the living god, the embodiment of one of the Egyptian gods. And he has a dream, and his dream has meaning. His dream has a sense to something's going to happen in the future, but he is unable to tell what it is. He has to turn around to his own people and say, what is this? And they don't know what it is. And then he has to turn around to a Hebrew who's basically what the Egyptians referred to as an Asiatic, a group of people that the Egyptians eventually learned to hate very deeply, especially because of the Hyksos and the relation between the Hyksos and what was going on in Egypt at the time and so on is a very, very tricky one. And a lot of people try to connect the Hyksos somehow to the children of Israel. Very questionable interpretation by itself. But what's very, very interesting is this idea that a pharaoh who is presumably a living god on the earth, he is the incarnation, I think it's like something like Horus or something like that. And the very interesting thing, by the way, about gods and kings in Egypt, that the iconography of Egyptian iconography has always been the same, it always stayed the same, consistent until Egypt stopped making iconographies. And what's very interesting there is it always represents someone who passed away, and there's not much of a difference between the king and a god in the sense of the iconography. And studies which have been done on Egyptian iconography has indicated that the first gods of Egypt were just basically someone's ancestor that they worshipped and believed that they were still out there protecting them. But a pharaoh, who is supposed to be the living god, he is the law, he is everything. One of the great differences between the Mesopotamian and Levant in Egypt was that in Egypt there were no law codes. Law was done by Pharaoh. And Pharaoh is supposed to be this everything, and suddenly he's stumped, and an Asiatic, a Hebrew, shows up and tells him what to do, and that puts everyone into shock. But what's very, very interesting is that in Egypt it was not unusual for Asiatics, or I would say people from what we'll call Levant, Great Assyria, to be involved in the Egyptian government. And we even have enough stories of different pharaohs who actually married women from the Levant, women from the Hittite kingdom, and so on. So the involvement of an Israelite in such a story, of a Hebrew at this point, in such a story, is not that unusual. It actually has an historical basis. And I had a really interesting discussion with Dr. Tzafria Ben Barak, who's connected to the Haifa University where I study, and she pointed out these things to me. I mean, I've read about this before, but to actually sit in the middle of a lecture and have her sit behind me, which was a very, very funny moment, because she takes off her heavy glasses because she's not a young person anymore, but she's a really, really, really insightful scholar, and she takes off her glasses and she puts them down on the desk in front of her with a thump, and she turns around to the lecturer and she says, "But how can you argue that the Bible was written later, if the stories and the peoples of the Bible indicate things that they would have never known if they lived hundreds of years later. This is an argument, by the way, dates back into the 1800s, either late 1800s or early 1900s. There was actually someone who noticed that linguistically there are words which appear in the cycle story of Joseph, like, for example, the Beit HaSohar, Beit HaAsurim, which is the prison he's in. He says this is actually something that reflects a little bit of a certain stage of Egyptian that didn't exist several hundred years later. So there are some interesting elements that indicate that this storyline is very, very consistent with the Egyptian world of around that time. And it was just very, very funny because she's arguing, and she's an old lady in her 80s, and she's arguing with the lecturer. And I just turned around to her with a smile, and she looked at me and she winked and she said, "But it's fact." And that's a very, very interesting thing to really point out. But we need to understand that there's a fundamental principle being pulled down into the story about what Egypt really is and what it represents. And one of the discussions that exists all the time is that Egypt actually presumably controlled the land of Israel even during the times of the tribes before King Solomon. And they asked the question of why isn't Egypt addressed in the Bible? And my response to this is the book of Genesis addresses Egypt in enough amount to make the point that there is Egypt. Egypt is around, but we need to understand that Egypt is irrelevant. And the Egyptians, by the way, did the exact same thing. There was this question of why doesn't the Egyptians mention the enslavement of the Israelites? It was such a big thing. And Dr. James Hoffmeyer says about this, because Egyptians didn't care. It didn't matter to them because it didn't work into the ideology of how they presented themselves. The Egyptians have been proven to lie multiple times over, what exactly happened to them historically. But then, we go to the Bible because of the anti-religious bias that you have in certain places. I'm not saying all scholars are anti-religious, I've had my share of discussions with scholars from different places, and not everyone is really that negative. There's a few schools of negative people, but because it's the Bible and it has religious connotations, it becomes suspect. And all of this actually connects really, really well to our story of King Solomon. First of all, the first word of our reading that we're reading from First Kings, or for example in the Septuagint it was Third Kings, because the Septuagint has a completely different division of things. The first word is Vayikatz. We're reading from 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 15, all the way to the end of the chapter, which is verse 28. And it actually starts with the word Vayikatz. So it's a very, very strong link to Parashat Miqetz, because they sound the same, even though the words mean completely different things. Miqetz means end of a sequence of time. Lakutz, Vayikatz, really means to wake up. They both have to do with ending something, but it's two different things. One is an end of a period, the other one is someone's waking up. And the other thing as well is that the story of King Solomon deals with several things. First of all, we have to understand that we actually do have a mentioning of Egyptian presence in the land of Israel during this period, a period where presumably the Egyptians were still kind of around in the area. Because Pharaoh, according to the Masoretic text, Pharaoh takes Gezer and gives it to his daughter, who marries King Solomon. So that's a very, very important link, because what it shows us is that the Egyptian presence in the land of Israel, even though it's more or less ignored, is still evident very directly through this story. We also have to understand, by the way, going back into the book of Judges, and also especially the book of Samuel, the Philistines were technically, at least some of them, were imported to the region through Ramses III, and Egyptian presence means that there was a connection to Egypt as well through them. So it wasn't the Bible really ignored the Egyptians. There are a few connections here and there, but for the overall idea of what the Bible is trying to tell us, it's not necessarily a history book. It has historical elements in it, but it is not a history book. It's the same way it's not a book of science. It's not here to answer every single question that we have. It's here to drive a very, very specific idea, which is, as my own professor said, Professor Bendov pointed out, he said, this is the story of God choosing mankind and then choosing a people from mankind to be sovereign over humanity, to be king, and to be king through a specific people who represent him. That's a very, very important thing, because we're talking about representation. We're talking about being chosen, and being chosen comes with responsibilities, and being, how would I put it, being arrogant about being chosen is also very, very wrong, because that's what happens with people throughout the Bible. They get arrogant about being chosen, make massive mistakes, and then everything falls apart. However, the other link of this story is a story of a king, but this king has a dream, and this king knows exactly what he has to do. So we have this dream element which appears in our storyline, because the piece just before it is that basically we go back to chapter 3 verse 5 and all the way to, let's see, yes, so it goes all the way from verse 5 until we actually see a response and so on. And then especially where he says to King Solomon in verse 11, Elohim said to him, because you have asked for yourself this thing, and you don't ask yourself lengthy life, and you didn't ask yourself for wealth, and you didn't seek the death of your enemies, and you ask for yourself to understand and to hear judgment. And that's a really, really important thing, because there's another link here with the fact that King Solomon does a judgment, which raises some questions about how law worked during his period. He is also a type of lawmaker, but his law is not something that's perceived to be divine by him being the mouth of God, but more that God gave him the wisdom. So there's this idea of Joseph has wisdom, Solomon has wisdom, both acknowledge that the wisdom comes from God. They are not the supreme being, they are not the one with the power. And then they both pass judgment, they both become rulers, they both govern their kingdom in the most perfect way. So we have this line here of Pharaoh and Solomon, and we have this line of Joseph and Solomon, which the Pharaoh and Solomon is a contrast of what wisdom is, and what knowledge is, what law is, how to govern your kingdom, and so on. And then you have your Joseph, which is again idea of kingdom and law and so on, but it's contrasted in a positive way, where with Pharaoh it's a negative way. So even here we have this acknowledgement of there's Egypt, but King Solomon's way better than them, and it's again there's all this little things that you need to see between the lines of what was being told to actually notice these details. So King Solomon, his knowledge, he acknowledges that his knowledge comes from God. This is what Joseph does as well. He says, I don't know, Elohim pitronim, God knows the answers. I don't know the answers, all comes from God. And Pharaoh acknowledges this. Interesting idea, not necessarily a contrast, actually something which is very similar. Everyone acknowledges that, Pharaoh acknowledges that Joseph has wisdom, everyone else acknowledges the same thing, and then we have the people acknowledging that Joseph is of such, he gets all the great power, he rules over Egypt. Same thing with King Solomon. Everyone acknowledges his wisdom, everyone is at peace, everyone does what King Solomon says. It's a very, very perfect reality, I would call it. And it's here to kind of give us an understanding of a very, very clear message that God is in control. God is king, and as long as you do God's will, your kingdom will stand, everything will stand, which is actually what King David says to Solomon in very specific verses in the will of King David. There's a small section where King David speaks to him, and this is known as this is chapter 2 from verse 1 all the way to verse 9, and King Solomon receives this message, but there's a few places where he tells him in verse 3, for example, you have to keep the laws of your God, the Lord your God, and it's very, very similar to the words of the book of Deuteronomy. And verse 4 does the same thing as well, and you can read through it by yourself. And you see that, and I'm behaving a little bit like a lecturer in class. It's a bit of the influence of my professors, but you should read these things in contrast to one another, and you actually see it. And the reason I say this is because I want you to see it, not that I just told you. So I want you to see all these pieces kind of fall into place. I'm just putting the seed in for the ideas. And what we actually get here is a much bigger, much more powerful, much more complex link of information between each one of the pieces, where we have all these contrasts between characters, contrast between themes, contrast between I would say theological and legal matters, and so on. Now, mentioning legal matters is a really, really interesting thing here, because I think the talk before we even go to the verses is probably the most important part of these recordings. The fact that King Solomon does judgment. This is something I've been pondering for a very long time, ever since I took a course that we dealt with the book of Samuel, and this was an interesting question that was raised about the difference between kingship in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and also the position of king as lawmaker. And even though we have the Torah, and we go to Mesopotamia, for example, where there were many, many law codes, so the Israelite world was much more similar to the northern world, where there were law codes and there were very, very precise mechanisms put into place by whomever it may be, that governed them. Well, in Egypt, it was a very totalitarian type of kingship. The king was above everything. No one can defy the king. No one could speak against the king. The king was the living God, and so on. While in Mesopotamia, you had sometimes prophets, like for example in Ma'ari. We have pieces that talk about prophecies to kings. But even if you go that far away, we also have the story of Bilam, where he speaks to the king, to Balak, the king of Moab, and he says to him, this is what the future is going to hold. He's warning him, and so on. So we have this tradition of prophets, even though in Egypt we hear about kings who prophesy. For example, Ramses III, not Ramses III, Thutmose III. Yes, it was one of the thirds. Thutmose III has a dream at the foot of the Sphinx, and if you look at the Sphinx, there's actually a stone in front of it, which is Thutmose III's inscription, where he talks about the dream and him being elected by the god, which is a very, very important thing, being elected by God, which is actually something really important to bring in here as well. We'll travel into that for a second. Being elected by God was a way to prove someone's kingship. Sometimes kings rose from places where they're not supposed to become kings. There's several stories like this. And King Solomon, though he was the son of the king, he was also in a rivalry with his brothers. So the fact that King Solomon had this dream and he was chosen and he can prove his wisdom and so on, probably put the lid on any debate over the legitimacy of King Solomon's kingship. And that's a really, really important thing to also point out here, because when there's rivalry or when there's disarray and we can't choose a king, it was not uncommon for someone to be elected by a god. I'm going to talk about the Mesopotamian world for a second. It's not unusual to hear about a god electing someone, and then that specific person, like for example, I think it was one of the Sargon II, I think, was in such a situation as well. Hazael, the king of Aram, we actually have him explicitly being crowned by the God of Israel through Elisha, and this was not uncommon. And Thutmose III, same situation. He has a dream as well. So again, this might be a reference to, look, they did this in Egypt as well, and we know about what they were doing too. But here we have King Solomon being elected king, and God standing beside him by appearing to him in a dream. So it's more of I would say like a cultural reference or a cultural thing that flows through the entire Bible as well. But this always, by the way, raises the question of, so where's the uniqueness of Israel? Where's the uniqueness of things? And the answer is that the uniqueness is still the principle of electing the entire people. This is not something you hear that commonly in the ancient world. And the stories of the Bible are extremely unique as well. There are many places where I hear people say, well, the Bible stole from this. No, it's not. That's not accurate. The Bible worked with mechanisms which will be recognizable to the people living at the time. The same way, for example, that if, say, for example, God would appear before someone today, he can appear through someone's television screen. I'm not saying it necessarily happens, but it's quite possible that information can flow through a radio or through someone's television screen, or God send text messaging someone because it would be something that's more culturally appropriate to our time. Because if, for example, you would claim that you have prophecy and you hear voices, people would think you're crazy. But if, for example, if a text message appears from nowhere or a broadcast appears out of nowhere, and we can scientifically prove that this is out of the blue, there's no hacking, there's nothing going on here, this directly came from somewhere or something that's outside of our reality, that might be a method. But again, it's always, prophecy is always a very, very tricky thing. But we need to understand that even though there are massive similarities, sometimes, not always, but sometimes there are, the word massive might be incorrect, but there's sometimes identifiable features that can be found in other cultures, it doesn't mean that this is some kind of forgery or something. You have to be very, very careful with this argument. As I can't remember exactly, I can't remember if it was Shmaryahu Talmon or Emmanuel, I think it was Shmaryahu Talmon, who warned quite a few years ago, I think back in the 80s or something like that. He said, with all these discoveries of the ancient Near East, we have to be very, very careful not to over-compare and think that everything is very, very similar. But there are themes that you can see every once in a while. Now, if we go into the subject of law, what's very, very interesting is that even though Deuteronomy says if you have any disputes at your gate, you go up to the place the Lord your God will choose, and you go to the Levite priest and the judge in those days, we don't necessarily always see that clearly in what goes on here. These are women that show up before the king with a dispute that may have not even reached any other place. They've actually been in Jerusalem itself. But the king here functions as a type of lawmaker as well, because the law here is a civic dispute that it's very questionable if the priest could really answer it. And this is, there's no point of bringing the Urim and Tumim in, because usually Urim and Tumim, as we see the very few examples we see of the Urim and Tumim being used, it's usually the king or the leader asking. When Joshua is elected, then he's told that he needs to ask in the Urim and Tumim to show that he's been elected. King Saul does the exact same thing. He speaks to the priest, and then he stops the priest in the middle. He stops the Kohen in the middle. So the Urim Tumim is not really relevant. Kohanim probably got involved more when it came to laws that have to be interpreted through something more cultic, I would say. But it's also possible King Solomon, and we know that he had Bnayahu ben Yehoyada, who was a Kohen sitting in his court as well. So it's quite possible that this was what Deuteronomy describes as the place the Lord your God will choose. But they go directly to the king, and the king makes a decision here. So this is actually a fulfillment of keeping Torah law through going to the king and asking him what to do. But there are some places where, for example, with King David, where where a woman dresses up and she says she's a widow and so on, and he passes on judgment. Or we have the whole story with Mephibosheth, the son of Shaul, and we have his servant that trick him, and he passes judgment in the middle of the field. So we sometimes have these places where kingship actually functions as you would see in other cultures. And it raises some questions in regards to how did the king perceive himself, and how do people perceive the king in regards to lawmaking and judgment. But we do see that the king is functional as a judge, as a not a lawmaker, but a law decider. And the wisdom here of King Solomon comes out in the fact that he actually has the ability to see into the psychology of the person standing in front of him with no actual evidence, and that's really the big thing. So now, because that's the main part of the story, we'll actually dive into it right now. So we start with verse 15. It says, Vayikatz Shlomo v'hineh halom. So Solomon woke up, and behold, it was a dream. So we're actually in the middle of a story reading this. Vayavo Yerushalayim, he comes to Jerusalem. Vayamod lifnei Aron berit Adonai. And he stood before the ark of the covenant of Adonai, which is a really, really interesting thing, because it doesn't use the tetragrammaton. Actually, the Masoretic text uses the word Adonai. I think there are some versions which actually do use the tetragrammaton. It'll be interesting to see if we actually have any fragments of the Book of Kings that points this out. But in any case, he has to go back from Giv'on. This is a really interesting thing because he goes to Giv'on where the tabernacle is, but the ark is still sitting in Jerusalem. So he has to split his time where he has to, if he wants to sacrifice anything, he has to go to Giv'on. But when he wants to stand in the presence of God, he actually goes to the ark, which is a really, really important thing because what it shows you is that the ark is really where the presence of God is. And the service is somewhere else. Now, this actually might work into the question of, did the Second Temple have any authority because there was no ark? Well, the fact remains that the ark was in Jerusalem, but the tabernacle was in Giv'on, and they still were allowed to do service. So wherever the ark might have been, say, for example, it's still in the Jerusalem area, so or under the Temple Mount, then we don't have a problem. Even if we say the ark was taken away from Jerusalem, the reality of the idea of having a functional tabernacle in Giv'on without an ark is something that gives authority to the idea of building a temple without an ark, even though we know the presence of God is connected to the ark and not necessarily the location of where the tabernacle or the temple is. So that's a really, really interesting thing to pay attention to, because people ask this question, did the Second Temple have any legitimacy? And the answer is yes, because it's not completely solely dependent on the idea of the presence of the ark. Even though the lack of presence of the ark is a problem, in Giv'on there was no ark and they were still sacrificing there. So he has to return to Jerusalem. He stands before the ark. V'yal olot v'yas shlamim, and he rose up, he burnt offerings, and he made shlamim, he made peace offerings. Vayas mishteh lechol avadav, and he did a feast to all his servants, because this was a point of rejoicing. This is the recognition that he needed to know, because before that there was the whole argument, there was a rebellion. At least according to the Masoretic text, the Septuagint has a slightly different story to tell. At least the version B. And the reason I bring this up is because the last couple of weeks I've been dealing with the Septuagint, its version of this story, and this is like a culmination of the final stamp of approval that God appeared to the king himself and said, "You're it. I'm going to make you king, and now I just made a promise to you." So it's a reason to rejoice. So to link it to the wisdom principle, the two women show up. Az tavona shtayim nashim zonot el hamelech, and then after this event, two women who were prostitutes, and this raises a lot of questions about why doesn't he punish them to being prostitutes? Because the Torah does say, I think it's in Deuteronomy, Lo tachelet bitcha la'aznota. Okay, you will not desecrate your daughter to make her into a prostitute. So prostitution is perceived as something which is forbidden. So how come there's prostitution? We have to say, we live in an imperfect world. And these two women were obviously in sin, and there were people doing things which were sinful. But I wouldn't say it was tolerated, but it probably wasn't as attacked as you would think, or something like that. I've always been puzzled by this story. I've always had difficulty with this, and any attempts to say that the word zonah doesn't really mean prostitute and so on, that's far-fetched. There's a point to be made here that they were prostitutes because they didn't know who the father was and so on. But in any case, this also raises questions about what do you do with bastard children and things like that. It's very interesting that it's just passed on in the discussion here. No one even talks about it. So these two women come to the king. V'tamod lefanav, they stood before him, which means they stood before him for judgment. V'tomer ha'isha achat bi adoni. The one woman said, "Bi Adoni." So "Bi Adoni" is a short form of an oath, and she's opening her statement with an oath, saying, "As I, my Lord," which means as I live, as she says, on my life, my statement, my Lord, what I'm about to say is true. Ani va'isha azot yoshvot bevayit echad. I and this woman are dwell in the same house. Ve'eled imach babayit, and I gave birth with her together in this house that we live in. Vayhi bayom hashlishi leliti, and it was on the third day to my birth. And she's trying to give some evidence on probably the age of the child. So she said, my son was a little older, which means I could identify how old he was. Vateled gam ha'isha hazot, and this woman also gave birth. Now, difference of 3 days is really not enough, because even if the 3-day difference is too subtle, I would argue. So there's a discussion here of who exactly has evidence, but she's trying to present evidence that she's telling the truth, but she's presenting evidence that's very, very, very partial, and a lot of it's hearsay. ותלד גם האישה הזאת, and this woman also gave birth. ואנחנו יחדיו אין זר איתנו בבית. We are together, and there are no strangers with us, so there are no eyewitnesses. But I'm telling you, my son's 3 days older. זולתי שתיים אנחנו בבית. Except for the both of us, we're in the house. Verse 19 says, וימות בן האישה הזאת לילה. The son of this woman died during the night. Asher shachva alav. She laid upon him. She rolled over him. People used to sleep. People still to this very day sleep with their children. There's always this fear of suffocating the child through sleep, because when you breastfeed, sometimes the child breastfeeds while the mother continuously sleeps. There's always this fear of rolling over the child. And she says she rolled over him and killed him. Vatakom betoch halayla, and she got up during the night. Vatikach et beni me'etzli ve'amatcha yeshena. She took my son from me, and your servant, your handmaid, is asleep. Vatashkiveo becheka, and she laid him in her bosom. Vet bena hamet ishkiva becheki, and her dead son she placed in my bosom. Vakum baboker, and I woke up in the morning. So presumably they were both probably breastfeeding the children during the night. Vakum baboker laniket beni. I woke up in the morning to breastfeed my son, so just to make sure to feed him again. V'ineh met, and behold, he's dead. V'atbonen elav baboker, and I looked at him in the morning. Basically, she had to wait, because people used to wake up very, very early, so there wasn't enough light. So she realized he's not breathing, nothing, and she looks for light to see what's going on. She finally, when there's light, V'ineh lo hayavni asher yaladti, and behold, he's not the son which I gave birth to. I can identify this is not my son. So now she counters, the other woman counters in verse 22. Vatomer ha'isha acheret, and the other woman said, Lo chi, it's not thus. Beni achai uvnei chamet. My son is the living one, and your son is the one that's dead. V'zot omeret lo chi, and this one says, not thus. Bnei chamet uvnei achai. My son is your son is the dead one, and my son is the living one. And they spoke before the king. They all pleaded before the king, but none of them actually had tangible evidence. Now, the way law works is you have to bring evidence. But however, there's a little loop here. And what's the loop? The loop is that, for example, in cases that we have in Exodus, where it says that if a shepherd was out and an animal attacked the herd, and there are no witnesses, however, the shepherd can bring evidence of the death, then you can rule based on that the animal was taken or torn by a wild beast. When you have a situation like that, that's enough evidence. You don't have to actually have eyewitnesses. However, in our situation here, there are no eyewitnesses and there's no actual evidence. We're only talking a couple of days in. After giving birth, children change, who can recognize, who can identify. There have been cases of mix-ups in hospitals where someone accidentally gave someone else's baby away, and they never really realized until years later when they realized, the parents are both have black hair and the child has blonde hair, and then the other family is the other way around. You have situations like that. So a couple of days is not enough. So really what's happened here is that King Solomon has been brought a case with just an argument with no actual evidence. And this is for anyone who is a judge, anyone who has to deal with law, it's a problem. Who are you going to prove? Who are you going to prove is telling the truth? The one holding the baby or the one claiming that the baby is hers? What do you do in such a situation? So King Solomon doesn't invoke some special power here or some kind of ordeal or something like that. What he does is he uses psychology. He has the wits to understand how to manipulate the situation to get the truth. So what does he do? Vayomer hamelech zot omeret ze beni achai. Now, the King Solomon, something a little theatrical here. He probably understood he has to do something a little theatrical, some drama to kind of create tension, to kind of scare them maybe a little bit, to see which one of them will crack. So he's theatrically talking to the crowd. So this is really where the judgment begins. It's not just the famous statement, bring a sword. It's actually what he starts with. He says, Vayomer HaMelech Zot omeret ze beni achai uvnecha met. This one says, "This my son is the living one, and your son is the dead one." Vezot omeret lochi, and this one says, "Not thus, benecha met uvni achai. Your son is the dead one, and my son is the living one." Vayomer HaMelech kechuli charev. This is the famous statement, and the king said, "Take from me a sword." Ve'aviu hacherev, and they bought the sword. This is not that they asked for some specific sword. It's a rule in Hebrew that you can say something and then relate back to it with a definite article. And he says, "Bring me a sword," and they bought really a sword, but it's the sword that he requested. Lifnei HaMelech, before the king. Vayomer HaMelech, and this is the drama of verse 25. Vayomer HaMelech gizru et hayeled achai l'shnayim, and the king said, "Cut the living boy into two. Utnu et hachetzi la'achat ve'et hachetzi la'achat, and give one half to this one and one half to the other one." Vatomer ha'isha asher bena achai, and now automatically a mother responds to such a thing. No, a mother prefers for a child to live, so she responds. Vatomer ha'isha asher bena achai, and the El HaMelech, and the woman whose son is the living child, she said to the king, "Ki nechmeru achameh al bena," for her mercy had come up over her son. Look how it extends the statement. She doesn't just jump out. We're being thrown into her psyche to prove that this is what the king was doing. Vatomer, and she said, "Bi Adoni, as I live, my lord, tenula hayelud achai, v'amet al temitu." Give to her the living boy, and don't kill. She doesn't say really please, but do not kill him. However, the other one, who's spiteful, she's a very horrible person. She doesn't care. It's a sum zero mentality. Either I get this, or no one gets anything. And it's interesting. Maybe King Solomon, might be a detail that we're not seeing. Maybe King Solomon, part of the wisdom was also to read body language. He was able to identify her body language. He was identify the looks on their faces. Maybe he even looked at the baby, and kind of was able to identify which one was the real mother. Maybe he was able to see some features that indicate that this was the real mother, unless the mothers were relatives, which is possible in such a reality. And he might have actually already had an idea who's whom. But what's very, very interesting here is that he wanted to see how they would respond, and he probably didn't pull this statement out of nowhere. He noticed something about them. So the judgment is not just the psychological side here of scaring the real mother into protecting her child, because that, if someone's adamant about the idea that this is her child, then she can lie in the same way as well, because the real mother calls out first. The second mother could have pulled the same trick, which means that part of King Solomon's wisdom here is not just the fact that he threw a psychological boomerang at them or something like that, but also that he probably was able to figure out throughout the statements between the two plaintiffs that there was something going on with one of them, and he was able to identify that there's something that he can manipulate to pull out the information. But for that trick to work, he had to see this, he had to figure this out, and that's really part of the wisdom that's brought here. However, vezot omeret, and this one, however, the other one said, "Gam li gam lach lo yeh gezoru." Also to you and to me there will not be, cut him. The king sees this and responds. It says, "Vayan hamelech vayomer tenu la hayelud achai." And the king responded and said, "Give to her the living boy. V'hamet lo tamitu hi imo, and surely do not kill him, for she is his mother." The idea here is to show that the king had a very, very complicated wisdom that enabled him to see into things that others can't see, to be able to understand things that others can't understand. And this is why, by the way, King Solomon becomes a symbol of wisdom. And this is why King Solomon specifically becomes a symbol of wisdom in esoteric writings of the Second Temple, known as talking about the wisdom of King Solomon of casting out demons, something that became very, very prominent in Second Temple Judaism. But the reason is because King Solomon's wisdom was perceived as being something that saw beyond human eyes, and this is why it was considered to be a power that enabled him to control many, many things. and this is why his name is linked to a book called The Wisdom of Solomon, which is a very, very, very late book, written by Kabbalists. So I think they say somewhere in the 6th or 7th century, something like that. It's a very, very late book. There's also another, I think, called The Keys of Solomon or something like that. It's a whole bunch of books that all bear names like the Sword of Moses, stuff like that. And the reason they picked this character, this is very, very, very common with the pseudo-epigraphic writings of the Second Temple, which include the Book of Enoch, and what's known as the Apocryphon of Moses, which there's an argument if you should call that book by that name. And there are different books in the Dead Sea Scrolls which are known as pseudo-epigraphia, because they kind of take someone's name and they use their name as if this person either spoke to them or they're the ones who wrote. And I've seen multiple people point out that, the Book of Enoch is ancient. It isn't. If you actually read the Book of Enoch, it's loaded with things that belong to the Hellenistic world and the Roman era and so on. It's very, very easy to see if you understand this material well enough. But what's very, very important here is the idea of King Solomon's name being linked throughout the generations to secret knowledge, powerful knowledge. Even the Freemasons, they have this big thing about the masonry of Hiram, who was connected to King Solomon. The story echoes throughout the centuries, throughout the generations of what King Solomon did, and each person took a different interpretation to it. And as you can see, I kind of took his wisdom is very, very close to natural wisdom, but it's also wisdom that he has to be very, very cunning and very, very wise. That has to be a blessing from God. And the story proves that the request of King Solomon was fulfilled, which means that God is really, truly with him. And this is really what happens in verse 28. And this echoes a little bit what we have with what Pharaoh says about Joseph. So it says, Veishme'u chol Yisrael, and all Israel heard, et hamishpat asher shafat hamelech, the judgment which the king ruled. Vayir'u mipenei hamelech, and they feared from the king. Why? Because they realized that there's something beyond human knowledge here. Ki ra'u ki chochmat Elohim bekirbo la'asot mishpat. For they saw, for the wisdom of Elohim is within him to do judgment. And there's something very, very similar that Pharaoh actually says about Joseph. So it says in Genesis 41, verse 37, Vayitav hadavar be'enei Pharaoh, and the words seemed good in the eyes of Pharaoh, ve'enei kol avadav, in the eyes of all his servants. Vayomer Paro el avadav, and Pharaoh said to his servants, Hanimtza chazeh ish asher ruach Elohim bo. Is there a person like this found? A man like this has been found. Has there been a man like this found? Sorry. Who has the ruach Elohim bo, who has a spirit of God within him. And he says, Vayomer Paro el Yosef, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, Acharei hodia Elohim otecha et kol zot, after Elohim has revealed to you all of these, En navon v'chacham kamocha. There is no one wise, there is no one with insight and wisdom like you. That's very, very similar. And then he actually becomes ruler over Pharaoh's house. You have to think about it, that King Solomon is ruler over Israel, ruler over God's temple. So he is very, again, a similarity to Joseph. Okay, so as you can see, I prefer to take much more of trying to understand the literature of what's going on here in the background and so on, instead of trying to go into speculations and ideas that might kind of stretch us out to a lot of symbolic things and so on, because that literally doesn't end. And Second Temple Judaism was full of this. But I want to kind of sometimes go more into just reading the text as a pshat, as a simple text, and see what the connections are, because we need to comprehend this idea. And I spoke about this in a recording that I did several months ago, where I talked about this is a recording I did with Ryan White, my good friend Ryan White, and I talked about the idea that there's a long theme that goes throughout the entire Bible, and there's all these different links. And one of the mistakes I think that scholars sometimes do is they try to think that, that's the imitation of that. No, these are themes that link different ideas and create contrast in larger story cycles. And I think that sometimes that's a little missed, and I think that this story is a really, really interesting representation of the idea that if you do God's will, God stands next to you, and these ideas could repeat themselves throughout history because God wants to be consistent in the way he responds to mankind, so we can identify when he's involved with us. So I hope you enjoyed this recording. And as a reminder, always, you can go to HebrewInIsrael.net and listen to other programs, because sometimes people listen to this on YouTube, sometimes people listen to this on iTunes, but you can go to the website. That's where the entire collection exists. Again, if what I do here is helping you understand the Bible better, please remember that there's a lot of work that has to be put into making these recordings, and a lot of study that has to be done. So please consider donating so I can get more material and spend time producing these programs. But in any case, the most important thing is to share, to comment, to think, to respond to things. But always remember that this is always a learning process for all of us. We can disagree on things and sometimes make a comment and have great understanding and suddenly come to insight that, for example, I wouldn't notice. I have had many cases like this in the past, to learn from one another, and then sometimes see into things, and then return to material and say, okay, let's look at this now from another angle. In any case, thank you again for joining me. Kol Tov.